Joining us now in the Cipher Brief studio is Roule. Norm is the former National Intelligence Manager for Iran at ODNI. He was the senior most intelligence source for the U.S. government, really lending into a lot of policy that was made during his time in government. Norm, I really don't know many people who understand the region better than you. So I thought it would be great to talk to you about the recent spike that we're seeing in violence in the Middle East in general and what you think this means. We're seeing attacks in Yemen, obviously a ramp up of violence in Gaza, Syria, Lebanon. What does all this mean?
Good morning, Suzanne. So you're correct. We're seeing three relatively contained but very intense chunks of violence that have erupted in the Middle East between very different sets of actors. Some good news, it doesn't look yet as if these eruptions of violence will spread into a broader region conflagration. It doesn't look as if any of these actions will have an impact on global energy or commodity markets, the global economy. It doesn't look yet as if they'll produce any large migration issues. There will be loss of lives, particularly in Gaza, which is a tragedy, obviously. To a lesser extent in Yemen and Syria. So maybe I can break this down. What we're watching is a continued erosion between Hezbollah and Syria, which in many ways is a good thing. We're seeing negotiations fostered by the Trump administration, led by Morgan Ortagus from the U.S. side, bringing Israel and Lebanon together to deal with long-standing, small but critical border disputes. And as Lebanon and Israel come closer together to resolving their differences, Hezbollah seeks to survive. And one of the things they need to do to survive is weapons. They engage weapons smugglers from Syria. There are criminal gangs. There are sympathetic members of the former Assad government. We have seen violence between elements of the Syrian government, perhaps out of the control of Damascus. It's unclear. Take retribution, bloody retribution against the Alawites of Syria. But we've watched in the last week 3 Syrian soldiers be kidnapped and executed by individuals tied to Hezbollah. At first, Hezbollah denied involvement and then admitted some role. And then we saw Syria and Lebanon, Lebanese Hezbollah engage in some violence. There's nothing good to say about violence, but if there is a small silver lining to this, it shows that it will continue to be difficult for Iran and its primary proxy in the region, Hezbollah, to use Syria as a channel to bring people, money, and stuff into Lebanon, and that's good for regional peace. Moving to Gaza. That's more complicated. Hamas refused to accept multiple U.S. proposals to extend the first phase of the ceasefire. The Trump administration did pretty much everything it could to get that first phase extended, to include meeting with Hamas itself. This made the new violence, new military operations on the part of Israel inevitable. And President Trump himself warned that Hamas would have hell to pay if they didn't release hostages. Hamas chose badly. Israel, in essence, hopes to do a couple of things here. And this is complicated. Israel hopes to degrade Hamas's capacity to reform politically within Gaza. Hamas has been touting its ability to do so, wearing crisp uniforms as it cruelly paraded hostages in a circus-like environment. Israel needs to crush those elements. It has indeed killed a number of Hamas mid-level actors who have appeared, and it now appears to be engaged in a campaign to ensure that Hamas's militant leadership as well as political element in Gaza is destroyed. The Israelis are also seeking to conduct types of operations that will prevent Hamas from moving hostages around in the Byzantine Gaza environment. Will it be successful? It's too early to say. It is certain that there will be a loss of Palestinian lives. The Hamas Ministry of Health has stated that 400 Palestinians have died. Certainly a large number of those are almost certainly Hamas fighters, but it's unclear as to how many of those will be civilians and fighters. There is a political element to this, and it's complicated. And I'm almost loath to talk about this because we're in a world where we have Israeli family members of hostages who are telling the Israeli government, do whatever is needed to get my family member or their remains back. Mm-hmm. We have Israeli family members of soldiers who have died in Gaza saying, my son or daughter's death should not have been wasted by allowing Hamas to survive. We have Israeli sons and daughters fighting in Gaza today whose lives should not be wasted on a political campaign. You have hardliners who have always stated the only way to win this campaign is through a military effort. This is an intensely political issue within Israel with multiple opinions on different sides. However, there are those who believe that this campaign is in part driven by Prime Minister Netanyahu's political motives. That may be unfair, but there are people who say this. There is a political issue in Israel at present. The Israeli government is required to come up with a budget on March 31st. If they don't do so, then the government collapses. They'll have about 3 months to form a new government, or call for elections rather. By undertaking these operations, they have been able to pull back some hardline supporters and perhaps strengthen the government. I'll leave it to others to say how much of this is, what motives drive this operation. But what we should say is this, these operations are probably a new normal. The Trump administration has supported Israeli operations because Hamas chose badly. Egypt is going to have to put significant pressure on whatever is left of Hamas's leadership to pull them in a different direction to release hostages. And the hostages that remain are likely in mortal peril. We should not be surprised if some hostages are killed either by Hamas terrorists, murderers that they are, or perhaps even in the military campaign the Israelis undertake. The last area of conflict, of course, would be Yemen itself. The Trump administration has initiated operations aimed to end the Houthi ability to block traffic in the Red Sea. The Biden administration routinely conducted such operations, but whereas the Biden operations were focused on defending against Houthi attacks and degrading Houthi capabilities, the Trump administration is adding to that operations that clearly are aimed to deter Houthi decision makers from undertaking these attacks. It's too soon yet to say the impact of these operations. The Houthis remain defiant. They've fired at least one missile against Israel, a small number of drones, and one missile against the U.S. But this is not something that could be handled quickly. It is clear that the Trump administration is going to deal with this in a more decisive manner than the Biden administration. There are some terrifically stark statistics that go with this issue. The Houthis have attacked American military ships and I think American civilian ships 175 times. Now, we need to put that into perspective. American sailors, men and women, have been the target of Houthi missiles and drones 175 times, and whatever we have done has not been sufficient to stop them. They have also attacked civilian ships of other countries more than 140 times. They have sunk ships. They have killed Vietnamese, Filipinos. They have come very close to creating the world's largest environmental disaster with shipping oil and fertilizer. And they have damaged communications cables that are critical to the global economy. The president has stated that this campaign will both continue until the Houthis are deterred. And he has also stated that he will hold Iran directly responsible. Now, that language is important for a couple of reasons. It's the toughest language the U.S. has issued regarding Iran, regarding on Yemen since this conflict began. Usually, the U.S. language will describe the Houthis as Iranian supported or enabled, Iranian trained, and we leave it at that. The action against Iran is a symbolic sanction, a stern tweet, a stiff diplomatic message, and we leave it at that. This language is not so different from what the Trump administration issued prior to the killing of Qasem Soleimani. I want to close with one more comment on the U.S. attack on Yemen. This is in support of freedom of navigation in a body of water that generally supports actors in the Red Sea. Now, that is Israel, but it's also Jordan. Jordan has suffered the loss of tens of thousands of shipping containers, and that primarily impacts the Palestinian population of Jordan. They work in those shipping industries. It has cost Egypt $7 billion in 2024 and has damaged the Egyptian economy, and it has prevented humanitarian aid from reaching Sudanese who are suffering terribly in a civil war. So this is a regional issue, but more than that, this trade impacts largely Europe. So at a time when people routinely talk about the United States pulling out of the global community or architecture, the United States is making perhaps one of the most robust gestures of supporting that architecture unilaterally without the support of Europe and risking American lives to do so. My last comment is that the president's approach to doing this on the escalatory ladder is relatively traditional. An escalatory ladder begins with private and public messages, don't do this, moving assets to the region, striking facilities, ancillary targets, moving up the chain of leadership. This is what the White House is doing. What the president is doing is similar to what was done not only by the Biden administration as they targeted Iran-supported militias, Kataib Hezbollah, that killed Americans in Jordan, but of course the Trump administration's actions that led to the death of Qasem Soleimani.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
Norm, I want to ask you, I want to really zero in on Iran a little bit more because you did a great job of kind of walking us through the region and where we are right now in Yemen, the Houthis, in Gaza, Hamas, Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah. I mean, Iran is this sort of central, obviously these are proxy organizations and they wouldn't be able to continue the level of violence that they've been perpetrating over the years without Iran's support. So it's great that, you brought up that this president is taking very strong language against Iran. But how can this president, who is becoming known in his second term as a very anti-war president, how can this president put teeth to this? I mean, what are you going to do? Sanction Iran more to try to get a change in behavior? What is the deterrence lever here?
The Trump administration's approach to Iran has had, I think, about 4 pillars, and it's been consistent. The first pillar is no war, but don't push us. Mm-hmm. This is the administration that killed Qasem Soleimani. Mm-hmm. This is the administration that fired missiles into Syria. This is the administration that is undertaking sanctions against traditional allies, trade sanctions. This is not an administration that should be tested. This is also coming at a time where Iran's vulnerability to American military technology, which one may speculate was likely known to Pentagon planners for some time, is now public knowledge. Mm-hmm. The second element of the Trump administration approach is maximum pressure is back. and it's real. And the Secretary of Treasury has made a number of statements supported by the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State that is directing or focusing on allies and other partners that we will not tolerate trade with Iran. And I would expect more meaningful sanctions and pressure on Iran's oil industry in coming weeks, if not days. And that's for real too. The administration is looking to bankrupt Iran. That may take some time. The third issue is we will provide Israel with whatever it needs to protect itself against Iran and to conduct those offensive operations it needs to defend protect its national security from existential threat. Now, that doesn't mean a massive war on Iran. We're not sending those types of military capabilities around Israel right now, but we're providing them with bunker busting equipment. And last, the United States is working on a diplomatic option. We have conveyed to the Iranians repeatedly that publicly and reportedly through the United Arab Emirates with a letter through a very experienced and deeply reasonable diplomat and a friend of mine, Anwar Gargash, a letter to the Iranians that the Trump administration has not unreasonably stated this current situation is approaching something that could lead to military conflict. Iran must recognize it cannot have a nuclear weapons program, and it cannot be in a position of using the sanctions relief from that program to simply fund and create militias in the region that repeat what we're seeing in Yemen and what we have seen on October 7th. So I think the Trump administration's approach has been consistent, but we're in an early chapter of the novel, the book on where this will all go.
Norm, part of your job and your very senior role in government and understanding the dynamics of the Middle East, and in particular on Iran, was to sort of predict the effect of certain policy that may be decided at any given time. And so I wonder, while you're laying out all this in a phenomenal way for us to very easily understand the dynamics here, how do you think the Iranians will respond? Because when we saw the first sort of very strong language coming out of the Trump administration aimed toward Iran, we had the Iranian president, as it was translated in the headlines, say, do whatever the hell you want. What do you think the Iranians will do in terms of how they're going to respond to this? What are their options?
I don't think there's much surprise there. So I think first you have to define the Iranians. So the Iranians are indeed the supreme leader who will set the left and right lanes of policy. And he is 86 and rather 86 in just a few weeks. But much of Iran's leadership, the bulk of Iran's leadership, are individuals whose worldview has been shaped by events since 2001, 2003. And in many ways, this is the third time Iran has been in this sort of situation. So consider elements from around 2001, 2003, 2013, 2014, and now. You have frictions or instability between the great powers. You have détente, or a situation where the Arabs aren't interested in a war. You have the United States interested in some kind of engagement. You have Europe absolutely interested in an engagement. You have no one interested in a war, but the United States, or in this case, Israel, is certainly moving in a situation where war is likely. You have Iran coming out of a period where it is seen for that time unprecedented unrest and unpopularity in the government. You have Iran at that time facing unprecedented inflation, unemployment, economic problems, and you have Iran at that time facing some sort of sense of political transition or leadership transition in government. If you put those three together, you sort of get the same approach by the Iranians, which is defiance publicly, a mix of we'll not negotiate under pressure and a little bit of we're ready to talk about this. So whereas Pezeshkian and others have indeed shown some defiance, you've also have the Iran's foreign minister talking to the IAEA, I think this week. You have talks have gone on with the Europeans. Iran's goal has got to be as follows. They want to delay pressure. They want to fracture coalitions that are against it. They want to delay the likelihood of military action. They don't want to provoke a war. They need to get through the leadership transition they're facing. They need to preserve their relationship with Russia and China. They need to make sure the détente with the Arab world continues. They need to see what they can do to preserve their nuclear achievements, but they'll probably be willing to consider some sort of reversible, in their view, capacity. But here's what's most important. What do they do with the Quds Force? Mm-hmm. And I've always thought this is the most important thing that policymakers, maybe it's a can that we've kicked down the road. Does the West, does the world, does the international community allow Iran to retain the Quds Force? No country in the world has a Quds Force. If the Quds Force, a terrorist militia organization, is allowed to exist, well, that means more Hezbollahs in the world. And we've already seen Iran attempt to move into Africa. We're watching Iran today, right now, try to build relations with the Burhan government in Sudan to send it drones and other capacities. It's trying to move into Africa to put a military base on the Red Sea, but also to allow it to build militia training centers and other work in Africa. Well, that will happen if the Quds Force exists. So Iran's goal is we can rebuild Hezbollah, Hamas, we can rebuild the Houthis if you have a Quds Force. Now, if the Quds Force is turned into a counter-terrorist element, as you have in most countries, we're in a different place. Mm-hmm. So I think in the end, the international community, and I'm not trying to be policy prescriptive, but if you followed a path that sought a nuclear deal that in essence constrained Iran's nuclear program permanently, provided reversible, if Iran proved to be unreliable, sanctions, and at the same time didn't allow Iran the capacity to use sanctions relief simply to provide more missile systems to the Houthis or drone systems as technology improves to expand Houthis' reach around the region, then that's a reasonable outcome for negotiations. Here's the challenge. Iran will seek to make lengthy negotiations, much as the Russians are apparently now about to start to do on Ukraine, because countries such as Iran or Russia know that the United States has many things going on its schedule. They have darn little on their schedule in many ways. So all they have to do is say, Suzanne, you're the Secretary of State. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to talk to you for weeks and weeks on end about this issue. And it's all I've got to do. And you're not going to walk away. Now, if you are willing to walk away, and I think the Trump administration might be a walk away kind of an administration, that puts pressure on me. But if not, sooner or later, you'll cave. Mm-hmm. And that becomes the challenge for the world. Do we allow the Quds Force to exist? Are we willing to walk away? Will we use military action against Iran?
I always find our conversations fascinating, Norm, for so many reasons, but one, just understanding better the dynamic of what is effective when it comes to policy. You mentioned negotiations. Let's talk about Russia-Ukraine. I mean, these talks are happening in Jeddah. I'm very interested to kind of get your thoughts on, we understand we've all been reading the open source report and the headlines about the difficulties in getting the Russian president to agree to a lot of the terms that the Trump administration is asking for. But in terms of the region in the Middle East, why is Jeddah so symbolic in this? It's a little bit different than talks that have been held in the past. And is it signaling sort of a shift in dynamics in the region as well? Just talk to me a little bit from that perspective.
No, that's a good way to describe it. So let's go back just a little bit in history. When King Salman and the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ascended power, and we have then Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates was in power, they began an initiative to make their country sort of the center of the region in many ways. The Saudis built on that initiative and sort of became the center of the region. And you had a number of meetings of the Arab League, Organization of Islamic Conference, Muslim World League, Gulf Cooperation Council began their meetings routinely in Riyadh or Jeddah. But then those meetings expanded. You suddenly had meetings of the Central Asian states, of the Caribbean world leaders, of Xi Jinping, of Joe Biden, of Zelensky, of Putin. Saudi Arabia has, and in a different way, the Emirates, they are now capitals of capital. This isn't just money. This is money that's being used for transformational purposes in societies. If you view this just in terms of sort of profit of a business, you miss the entire point. This is how societies will be moved in the coming generation. And these countries are now drawing people into this vision. And as a result, their global influence has increased tremendously. So the idea that the United States would meet Russians in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, and not Geneva is a significant shift in history. And you'll also note that in many of the discussions, Europe isn't mentioned. And we're watching this shift from Europe to these countries. Now, this isn't exactly new. The Qataris played a large role with Afghanistan, and they played a role with Iran, and the Omanis and other countries played a role with Oman. And this also isn't entirely new in terms of, the Europeans weren't so upset about not considering Gulf and Israeli interests when they had private talks with the Iranians. So now that there are private talks in the Gulf and the Europeans aren't present, I'm not sure they have much of a foundation to complain, but it is what it is. But we're now about to watch technical talks take place between Russia and I believe Ukraine and Jeddah. I'm not sure. I don't know yet if Secretary of State Rubio will participate. And this is at a slightly lower level than senior people who are meeting. And this is making Saudi Arabia, its architecture is being formalized into something that's very, very, it's very different from anything it's had in the past. And something much similar to what we would have seen with a Paris or Berlin and certainly a Geneva for the last 40 or 50 years. The world has changed.
Mm-hmm. Just kind of ripping on a headline again that didn't really get big headlines, but Sheikh Tahnoun made a visit to the U.S. and met with the United States president. Talk to us a little bit about why this is important and why people should be paying attention to this.
Sure. So it's happening right now. The Emirati National Security Advisor, Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed Al Nahyan, is currently on an official state visit to Washington. He arrived Monday. It's his first visit since the Trump administration came to the White House. It follows what was a very successful trip by the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Corporation and Emirati Minister for Minerals, Dr. Sultana Jaber, who was in Houston and in Washington, who also met with a number of senior officials. And these discussions are focusing on significant joint investments between the United States regarding artificial intelligence, semiconductors, energy, biotech, and regarding energy, which is the foundation of all of this, natural gas, petrochemicals, especially petrochemicals relating to data centers, infrastructure investments relating to energy. You can see how this is quite congruent with the Trump administration. Last night, President Trump held a state dinner for Sheikh Tahnoun, and it had all the trappings of a head of state dinner. Sheikh Tahnoun manages about $1.5 trillion in assets in a number of funds. And it's not just that these funds manage money. These funds follow the vision of Sheikh Tahnoun, which have a heavy artificial intelligence, high-tech basis. Sheikh Tahnoun is routinely considered to be one of the more visionary and tenacious and highly focused actors in the Middle East and international investment world on transformational technologies and focusing investments to build societies. So what the Emiratis are in essence doing is they're basically saying, how do we use our vast capital to transform our society for the next few generations in a way that provides us with a different world for our people, but also being the capital of capital, a reach between into India, Africa, the global north, the global south, building upon what was a highly successful COP, where they basically brought together energy producers and climate activists to say, look, there is no such thing as energy transition. Batteries aren't there. We don't have enough renewables. There's not enough energy for artificial intelligence. How do we produce maximum energy with minimum emissions as a team? And that approach is where they're going. Now, they're also talking to the Trump administration about Iran, about Yemen. No one wants a war. Where this becomes complicated is the Chinese will remain a significant commercial partner for not just the Emirates, but the entire GCC. It's been that way since 2014. This isn't anything that happened in any one administration. But the Emiratis have demonstrated themselves to be sensitive and very responsible in terms of addressing U.S. concerns on how they can access our most sensitive technology in terms of semiconductors and chips, with respect to ensuring that this doesn't somehow make it into malign Chinese realms. I should also mention that Sheikh Tahnoun, during his travel, is also scheduled to meet the head of Tesla, the head of Amazon, Meta, Oracle, Microsoft, BlackRock, and I think Palantir to close it off. And this is done in a typical whirlwind tour that he and Dr. Al-Jaber conducted, and their president Mohammed bin Zayed conducted last September. And it's going to happen in just 2 to 3 days. But they're meeting officials, multiple secretaries, high tech, and then building a plan from there. And you should look at the dinner last night with the president as about as tangible evidence as you can get at that the Trump administration's relations with the Emiratis is rock solid.
Mm-hmm. Norm, as always, I really appreciate you putting all of this into context for us and connecting a lot of the dots. In addition to being the former National Intelligence Manager for Iran, you're now working as an expert consultant in energy, too. So I appreciate you pulling together all these threads for us. Thanks so much for being here today.
My pleasure.